So good morning, everybody. This is Massimo Leone, Director of the Center for Religious Studies at the Bruno Kessler Foundation. Today we have a very distinguished guest. Let me introduce him formally. Rabbi David Meyer is an ordained rabbi from the Yabok College, Rabbinic Seminary in London. And after finishing his degree in applied mathematics at the University of Paris, he obtained a master's degree from the École des études sociales in Paris, and later a master's degree in Hebrew and Jewish studies with distinction. He holds a PhD in religious studies from Catholic Universiteit Leuven in Leuven, Belgium, and is currently a lecturer at the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies at the Gregorian Pontifical University in Rome, where he teaches classical rabbinic literature and contemporary Jewish thought. Rabbi Meyer has taught in various universities and countries around the world, from Belgium to Peru to China. Thank you for coming to Trento as well, and also for adhering to the main theme of the series of seminars of this year, which is solitude. This is why the lecture that Rabbi Meyer will hold for us is entitled Alone on the Fading Path of Halakhah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to come to Trento. Really happy to be here. I had never been there before, so it's a lovely occasion for me as well, and to see Diana again, who had followed some of the classes at the Bea Center, the Gregorian. So really happy with this. The format of today is normally, of course, as far as I understood, a sort of 45-minute presentation and discussion. I might change that a little bit in the sense that, according to how it evolves, if we can have a discussion as the text that I'm going to present will happen, then we don't need the formal split in a way between the two. If, however, you prefer for me to go through all those texts first and then to have the discussion after, we can do that as we see how the morning unfolds. So I would like to start by just explaining a little bit the structure of what I want to say, just to give a bit of an overview of what we are going to talk about. It's obviously about loneliness in the fading pathway of Halakhah, Halakhah being a generic term to refer to Jewish law. It's a very textual presentation, so the documents will come as we talk. And essentially, there are four parts to what I would like to do. The first part is to start with a biblical excursus, and I want to take some biblical text just to set the context of loneliness in Jewish thought, or at least one possible context of loneliness in Jewish thought. So there's a few texts that we can look in the Bible. In truth, we could spend a whole hour and a half on one single of these texts, so I will be careful not to do that because I want to move on. But I'm aware, of course, that by not doing that, we won't explore the fullness of the text that I'm looking at. But essentially, the idea of the biblical excursus is to set the ground for the second part of the presentation and the discussion, which is more classical rabbinic, and it's to shift the focus from the theme of biblical loneliness to how the rabbi perceive loneliness in a legal sense in front of extraordinary situation. And this is where I call the places where Halakhah, the normative framework of Jewish law, suddenly fades and disappears. And by the way, please don't hesitate to interrupt me. If I'm making reference to things that you're not familiar with, I'd be happy to help. I don't know the context from which you're coming. So this will be done through one Talmudic text in particular, and from there I will move to a third part, which is more a contemporary halakhic loneliness, which is something that emanates from contemporary Responsa literature, which is collections of rabbinic answers to situations, in particular here during the Shoah, and in particular in Auschwitz, as a kind of, what can we say about the legal loneliness in this particular context. And I think this will be something interesting to look at. And I will conclude as a kind of the fourth part, in the sense that the second part is both classical, rabbinic, and contemporary, so that's kind of second and third. But the fourth part will be, if we have time, to have a look at maybe the possibility of a similar loneliness in Christian theology, which is, of course, completely outside my field of competence, but something that I was confronted with, particularly being a professor at the Gregorian. Those are the kind of comments and texts that I'm looking at. So I kind of hope that sort of makes sense in terms of what the presentation is about. And I think where I would like to start is with the first biblical text, which, as you can imagine, it's not a great secret, is coming from Genesis 2. So I think this is the first text. Maybe if we can put it screen for everyone. Okay, perfect. Right. So there are just essentially two approaches that I would like to take. One is what I call existential loneliness. Sorry, there's an L I see missing already. So existential loneliness. The second one will be something more situational loneliness. And I would like to try and point to some of the questions and that are here raised by the text. And please, of course, just feel free to question as we go along. So the best is to start by just reading the text, and we'll move down the verses. It starts here with verse 15, and it goes to pretty much the end of the chapter. So I just read it now and then point to what I think is interesting. Now the Lord God, so this is such a well-known text, took the man and he placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to guard it. And the Lord commanded man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat. Those are the text of creation story. But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for on the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. So that's the first commandment. And the Lord said, and this is where because it starts to be more interesting for the topic we're dealing with, it is not good, it is not good for man to be alone. I shall make him an helpmate opposite him. So the first thing we can say about this, I mean, this is the first kind of occurrence of the question of loneliness in a way, is it has, or it is attached to a sort of qualitative notion. It's lotov, it's not good. The difficulty, of course, is we don't really know what not good implies. I mean, we know good appears before, because at the end of every day of creation, and the creation of man comes at the very end, but at the end of every day of creation, we know it's done, it's good. But apart from that, we don't have quite an understanding. But here, there is something about loneliness that is very negative, or that is presented as something which is quite negative. The second thing that I would point out in this particular verse, it's not good for man to be alone. I should make him a helpmate opposite him. The opposite him might be something that in English doesn't resonate in a sort of intuitive way, because there's a kind of an opposition between the helpmate and the opposition. But in Hebrew, it's about la'asot ezer kenegdo, to do for him an ezer, so someone's going to help, okay, from la'azor, okay, and kenegdo, meaning literally against himself. So there is something here about this loneliness that is apparently not so good. And at the same time, the price of this loneliness, or the price of not being lonely, depending on where we look at it from, which is to have someone to help, but to have someone that is against. So of course, when we are lonely, there is no opposition as such. As soon as we have this companionship that is going to be created, there is an element of help, and there is an element of opposition, to which we will come back in a minute. And surely, when we read at the text here, the first thing that I would say come to mind is that we would expect the creation of Eve to follow, because that's the logic unfolding of the narrative. God said, it's not good. I'm going to make him Eve. So let's make her. And here we have two verses which are coming at the next one. And the Lord formed from the earth the beasts of the field, and it grew fowl of the heavens, and it brought it to man to see what he could call it. And whenever the man called each living thing, this was his name. And man named the cattle and the fowl of the heavens and all the beasts of the field. But for man, he did not find a helpmate opposite him. So we have this kind of suspension of the story, where suddenly, what is the theme about? If you look at that and you say, what is the theme here of verse 19 and 20, the two verses I just read? The theme is the theme of naming, the question of names, okay, which seems to be, to a certain degree, unrelated, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, but that seems to be unrelated to the question of loneliness. The reader has a kind of a strange experience if he pays attention to the structure of the text, which is this moment of suspension, which is about two verses unrelated to loneliness, but which in fact creates an effect of loneliness. Because you expect the creation of Eve to appear, and then suddenly you're left alone with two verses you have no idea what to do with, seem completely unrelated. And I think the structure of the biblical text just creates this space of loneliness as we read it. And then it starts again on verse 21, okay? And the Lord God caused a deep sleep, in Hebrew, the tardema, to fall upon man, and he slept. And he took one of his sides, and he closed the flesh in its place. And the Lord God built the side that he had taken from man into a woman, and he brought her to man. And man said, this time it's bone of my bones, the flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called Isha, because she's coming from Ish. And okay, let me just pause here before I read the very last passage here. The text here goes back to what we expect to find, which is the creation of Eve. But the passage that is important is what you have here at the top. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep. Okay. So in a way, what's happening is the creation of Eve is the result of what the Hebrew calls the tardema, the deep sleep. The question is, what do we do with this deep sleep? So in a way, of course, the deep sleep is an expression of the sort of form of solitude, but not only, okay? Tardema in Hebrew is it's a sleep of being overcome by something. And I would like you to, if you can put maybe the next text on the board, which I think you should have. Don't worry. Stay on number one, and I'll just read you the text. It's the one that you hear. Don't have it, but in fact, I have it on my computer, but it's okay. I'll just do it by heart. There's a commentary of Soloveitchik, which is not the one that is here. That's for something else. There's a commentary of Soloveitchik on the word tardema, deep sleep, and he says that. So Soloveitchik, I don't know if you're familiar with his name. I mean, surely you are, but yeah, okay. So he was the chief rabbi of Boston at the time. He was kind of the key figure of modern orthodoxy in North America after the war. Soloveitchik writes that the tardema is the price that is required in order for man to exit his solitude. And what he means by that is tardema, he translated as the defeat. The defeat. One needs to be defeated in order to accept the presence of someone else, which has enormous ramification in political terms, certainly in any sort of situation we know. But in ontological terms, it's also an interesting thing. There is something of a totality that we feel, which might create our own solitude. But in order to accept the presence of the other, there is a need for this defeat. Man needs to be tardem. He needs to have fallen into this kind of being overcome by something that losing this control over himself. And the text here is, from that point of view, quite. So he points out to this element of the exit from loneliness. And if you keep going through that text, okay, what you will see in what is going to unfold is that at the end of the chapter here, and therefore, once Eve has been created, a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Interestingly, this loneliness and the escape from loneliness is never a win, because there's another loneliness that is greater. There's actually two other loneliness that is greater. The first one is the loneliness of the parent, to leave his father and his mother. So maybe this man from whom Eve was created after his own defeat somehow has escaped his loneliness. But there is now a generational loneliness. The parents experience the loneliness of, he has to leave his mother and his father. So loneliness reappears. Loneliness also reappears because they should become one flesh. Then suddenly the two becomes one again. So the tendency to have created something that is not lonely is completely overshadowed by something that suddenly becomes lonely again. So there is a lot of things in this particular text. And as I said at the beginning, we could spend the whole time actually looking at this text together and discussing it. I just want to move, because this is just to set the scene of what I would like to talk about. The passage from Job. So I took that passage from Job because it's maybe one of the most formative one. Talking about, this is Job who is answering Bildad. Bildad, one of the friends of Job, is in chapter 18. In chapter 19, Job answers Bildad and says, "My brother has put far from me, and my friends are wholly estranged from me." This is another kind of loneliness, okay? My kin has failed, and my family and friends have forgotten me. My guests and my servant girls think I'm a stranger, I'm a foreigner in their hearts. I call to my servant, and he does not answer. I must plead with him with my mouth. My breath is loathsome to my wife, and I'm repulsive to the son of my body. And it's kind of lovely stuff from Job. Even young children despise me. I rise and they speak against me. All my intimate friends abhor me, and those I love have turned against me. I mean, this is a different kind of ontological loneliness. Is somehow, I'm not alone, but I'm lonely. Okay, I have plenty of people around me. I have people who work for me. I have my children. I have here my maidservants. I have whatever the text says, my friends, my most intimate friends. But at the end of the day, I am still completely lonely. So this kind of existential loneliness, okay, is something that we find here quite strongly. And I would like here just to point to two things. So on the folder that I saw it, we had it. I'd like you to turn to in number one. This one. Yeah, in number one, if you can go to Soloveitchik on biblical loneliness first, and then we'll open the other one after. So I want to take this text from Soloveitchik, which I mentioned again on the word tardema. I want to take him here on the book, and it's coming from the same book. It's called The Lonely Man of Faith. And he has something here that is kind of interesting. If you follow down the page, I'm just going to read it as it's on the screen. The nature of the dilemma can be stated in a three-word sentence. I am lonely. Let me emphasize, however, that by starting and stating I am lonely, I do not intend to convey to you the impression that I'm alone. Okay, it's a different thing. Hence the interest of the passage from Job. I, thank God, enjoy the love and friendship of many. I meet people who preach, argue, reason. I'm surrounded by comrades and acquaintances, and yet companionship and friendship do not alleviate the passionate experience of loneliness which trails me constantly. I mean, it pursues me. Okay? I am lonely because at times I feel rejected and thrust away by everybody. So this is exactly the word of Job. Okay? Not excluding my most intimate friends. In the words of the psalmist, my father and mother have forsaken me. Interesting reversal of the loneliness we saw in Genesis 2. Genesis 2 is the loneliness of, you should leave your parents, your father and mother. And here is my father and my mother have forsaken me, because of course, at the end of the day, in the natural course of things, we survive our parents. And when we survive our parents, we experience another kind of loneliness that exists. So there is a generational, structural loneliness that is there. So my father and mother have forsaken me ring quite often in my ears, like the plaintive coming of the turtle dove. It's a strange, thus absurd experience, engendering sharp, enervating pain, as well as stimulating cathartic feeling. There is this double edge to loneliness. There is, on one hand, the sharp experience of pain. At the same time, there is something that is stimulating. And this is where it's going to become a little bit complicated. I despair because I am lonely, and hence I feel frustrated. On the other hand, I also feel invigorated because this experience of loneliness presses everything into me into the service of God. In my desolate, howling solitude, I experience a growing awareness that, to paraphrase Plotinus' apothegm about prayer, this service to which I, a lonely and solitary individual, am committed, is wanted and gracefully accepted by God in his transcendental loneliness and luminous solitude. So somehow there is this loneliness that kills, and at the same time, there is this loneliness that creates this infinite power. Because if you read in a pious way the words of Soloveitchik, then of course you say, okay, God's loneliness is only met when I experience my own loneliness. So in loneliness, piously speaking, God and I are on the same planet, and we meet there. But in a less pious way, there's something that's interesting here, because he also talks about this kind of this somehow infinite possibility that is created by this loneliness. That the lonely God who has this infinite power can only reach when I'm in my solitude, which creates, as he was saying on the previous page, not just the frustration, but the stimulation of loneliness. Then somehow we are called to question again, what does it mean? It's not good for man to be alone. I said the problem, when we read that verse, the problem is, we don't really know what it means. It's not good. And it's not good for who? It's not good for me, or it's not good for God that I'm alone. Because at the end of the day, if in loneliness, it's not just that I piously encounter the divine loneliness, it's I also encounter the infinite creativity of loneliness, then it's not good for who? Maybe it's not good for God. Not good for man to be alone like me in a certain way. So the question of loneliness here really has a very strong question mark, which I think is sort of important to have. And if we go back to the first text, I just want to just keeping an eye on the time. But if we go to the next page, I put here something about what I call the situational loneliness. So not just the existential loneliness, but the situational loneliness. And an interesting chapter here is Genesis 32. Okay, it's a very famous passage. It's about Jacob, who is leaving Laban with his family and his herd and everything, and he's going to meet his brother Esau. And of course, before the meeting, as we know, he has to cross this particular river called the Yabok, and this is what it says. And he arose during that night, and he took his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants and his 11 children, and he crossed the river of the Yabok. And he took them and brought them across the stream, and he took across what was his. And again, we have this expression, and Jacob was alone. Very similar to the expression we had in Genesis 2. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. So there's an issue here in the text. What does that verse really mean? Because there's a contradiction in the wording, right? So he was left alone, but suddenly there's a man. Okay, how do we understand that? So one way to understand this, of course, is to say, well, if Jacob was alone, who is he fighting with? Okay, one obvious answer is he's fighting with himself. It's a self-inflicted exercise of the more inward fighting that we're talking about. But then we read something that's kind of descriptive of what's happening. That's the passage we know. When he saw that he could not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip became dislocated, and he wrestled with him. And this angel said to him, let me go, for that is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you have blessed me. And then we rediscover in what comes just after. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name should no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have commanding power with the angel of God and with men, and you have prevailed. And Jacob asked and said, now tell me your name. And he said, what is it that I ask your name for? And he blessed him there. You have the resurgence of the 2 verses that were in suspension earlier in Genesis 2. There's the creation of Eve, or at least something that appears that it's going to be the creation of Eve. And then we have the question of Adam has to name the animals. And here we have a Jacob that is alone, fighting with we don't know who, maybe with himself, but at the same time comes back the question of names in a strange way. What is it about names? Why the issue of name is related to the question of loneliness, of being levado. I think it introduces a 3rd dimension of loneliness, which is not a 4th, because I talked about the existential loneliness, the generational loneliness, the current bits. We have the situational loneliness in the text, and maybe the 4th loneliness is the narrative loneliness, the loneliness with language. How do we feel when we live through an experience and we don't have the terms? And I'm thinking here, of course, of the Shoah in particular, but show lots of other examples. We've lived something for which we don't have the terminology to talk about. That's the problem of the mystics. They have experience and they have to fabricate terminology, which the terminology of the mystics is not an attempt at saying this is really what they saw or what they feel. It's more, they are in front of something, they don't have the terms, and they have to come up with something. And sometimes it becomes very complicated, like in Kabbalah or those kind of mystical texts. But when survivors of Auschwitz talk about planet Auschwitz, what they mean with the expression planet Auschwitz is, I don't have the term to talk about what I lived through. And so there is this kind of unbearable loneliness of having lived something and not being able to express it. So lots of different things which are in this text and for which we can talk about in a way infinitely. So those are kind of foundational texts which will allow me to move to the next part, but I'm very happy to take some questions if you have here, unless you prefer I just move on with whatever. Okay. But yeah. Okay. So I move on with the next part. So what I want to look at now is classical rabbinic text. So that's in folder 2, I think. So classical text, there's one here. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks. Right. So the situational loneliness, the rabbinic text I want to look at now is about, you can put it on the screen, is about this passage in the Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud, as a reference, Yerushalmi Trumot 8, section 8.4. It's also in the Midrash. You find it in different Midrashic and it starts with a story about situational loneliness. So I'm leaving to the side the existential part, and I'm focusing on this here. So let me read it to you here. There's someone who's called Ula ben Kosha, okay, which we don't know much about. Okay, he was taught by the Roman governor. So it's under the occupation of the land of Israel, Palestine in the Roman time. The man escaped and found refuge in a city of Lydia, which is where someone called Yehoshua ben Levi was functioning as the head of the city. Then the Romans surrounded the city and declared, if you do not deliver up the man, we will destroy the entire city. So the context is very easy. Either you deliver this guy, and we'll put him to death, or you don't, and we destroy all of you. So Yehoshua ben Levi went to Ula, this individual, we don't know what he did. They spoke with him, and he persuaded him that it is better for one man to die rather than the whole town to be wiped out on his account. That's a kind of a ethical dilemma, sort of things we can easily understand. There is this discussion as to whether or not it's better to sacrifice one for the sake of the many, and this is what this Yehoshua ben Levi seems to have done. And that's as far as it goes. The story then, and this is where the story is interesting in terms of your situational loneliness in what I call the fading path of Halakhah. Now, Elijah the prophet used to appear regularly before Rabbi Yehoshua. But after that incident, the prophet stopped visiting the rabbi. In desperation, Rabbi Yehoshua fasted 30 days, after which the prophet Elijah appeared again. So Elijah done something. The prophet stopped visiting him. He fasted for 30 days until the prophet comes back. And what does he say? He said, why did you stop coming? Asked Joshua. And Elijah responded, I am a friend of informers. Rhetorical question. Joshua answers and says, but I only did what the law allows me to do. And here he's quoting, if you can go a little bit further down, he's quoting a passage. I put it in Hebrew here, but it's only the beginning of it because it's quite a long text. He's quoting a text from the Tosefta Teruma, in which it says, if there is a bunch of people that are coming and someone is threatening them, are you allowed or not to deliver the individual to save the many? And the text goes on and says, after the passage that is here, the text goes on and says, well, if the individual is mentioned by name, the one that's going to be executed is mentioned by name, then in that case, you are allowed to deliver this guy in order to save the many. So Rabbi Yehoshua, back in our Talmudic text, just a bit before, sorry, I keep moving a bit, says, I only did what the law, what the Halakhah allows me to do. No, why did you stop coming? And he answers and he says, this is not Midat Chasidut. This is not the law for saintly men. This is not the law for saintly men. The job could have been carried out by another, but not by you. And so at some stage here, the text confronts us with a loneliness that we decide to have, a legal, ethical loneliness that we decide to have. Rabbi Yehoshua is right. There is a Talmudic text. There is a legal text, the Tosefta Teruma at the bottom of the page. That text does exist. And that text gives him the argument to say whatever he needs to say in order to save the many. So Yehoshua is not lonely. He has the document with him. He has the text with him. He has the legal document. But is that a law for people who have a pretension to be more than average people? You want to be average, you're not lonely. You want to be midat chassidut, which was translated here as a kind of a saintly man, then you have to accept that you can't hide behind that law. You are essentially lonely in front of an ethical dilemma. If you are not lonely in front of an ethical dilemma, how on earth is it ethical? That's the question here. If I can say that's what the law says, there's no ethical dilemma. I do what's written. But loneliness, the fading path of Halakhah, the moment when Halakhah is not sufficient, the Halakhah is never sufficient to deal with ethical problems. There's no legal system that is ethical in front, that is sufficient, in front of ethical. So we need loneliness if we need to rise to the occasion. If we don't, we just hide behind the law. Now, it's not given to everybody. That's the end. The job will have been carried out by someone else. If you don't have the ability to face that loneliness, when Halakhah stops to be meaningful problem, then okay, give it to someone else who doesn't pretend to be Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Give it to Mr. Landa, Mr. X. Mr. X is going to know the same rule and it's just going to do it. But you have to accept this loneliness. And here, the fading path of Halakhah is about this. Now, this is strengthened, I think, and I'm happy to take your question or to move along with that, but if you go just a little bit further down in the text, I've added another text, here, very short, but really, really beautiful text. It's from Leviticus Rabbah, which is another rabbinic collection from Midrash. And it says the following: Blessed, so I'm taking it here out of context, and it's always risky to take just one line out of a long midrashic development, but nevertheless, for the sake of trying to show something, it's relevant. Blessed be the eternal, but blessed be the eternal, who let himself be recounted. That's a really fascinating expression, mesupa. The eternal who let himself be told, be recounted with the action of the first tzaddikim, the first righteous people. And I put here, before the Torah was given. Since the Torah was not yet given, they did it by themselves. Why is the story of the patriarchs interesting? When we read the story of Genesis, why is it interesting? It's interesting because here's the story of people who tried to elevate themselves and they didn't have the law. They didn't have the document to tell them how to deal with situation. So they had to figure it out. And it is not with the Moses and the like that God is recounted. God is not recounted by Moses. Moses follows the law. He has the Torah. But if God is to be told, he's told through the experience of those who were lonely because they didn't have Torah. They didn't have the legal code. And this is why God can be recounted through them. Okay, which is really, again, there is something there where our loneliness, our acceptance of loneliness matches something about the essential experience of God who is also in that situation of loneliness. So it's a very short, but it's a really, really powerful text. God is not recounted by all those who came after, not the Moses, not the rabbis, not the Joshua, not all the righteous people who know the Torah from A to Z with all the ocean of the Talmud. This is easy. You have the text. What's interesting is when you are alone. And it is through them that God is recounted. So this kind of more positive acceptation of loneliness is really an interesting text. So that's for the classical rabbinic. Is that okay for everyone? Yeah. Okay, so if I move to the next piece, which is more painful, but I hope interesting. So again, it's in the folder. Yeah, right. So this is now a text in which we leave the classical setting of either biblical or rabbinic text, and we enter into this one, Rav Meisel, the reality of the Shoah. Now, Rav Meisel, he died in 1974, okay, and he was one of the known sages, the many, of course, who went to Auschwitz, survived, and because he was the head of the community, he was consulted by people in the camps as to what do I do in front of this ethical situation. So we take the kind of narrative of the classical rabbinic text under the Roman period, and I move it to Auschwitz. He published a first edition of his Responsa. So after the war, he published a set of texts of saying, those were the questions that were asked to me, and those are the answers that I gave. It's interesting because the people who were asking questions felt that by asking questions, they were not so lonely. So what is of interest, of course, is how he, as the equivalent to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi of the Talmudic text in his time, how did he perceive his loneliness? And what does it mean in relationship to either the companionship or the loneliness of the one who's asking the question? So the context, you have it here after the Hebrew. We can move down a little bit in the passage. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks. So the context is, and behold, on the following day, which was the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, when all who enter the world pass before him like sheep, this is a reference to one of the prayers. It was a day of tumult and confusion. Word spread from mouth to ear throughout the entire camp that towards evening they would take the youth to the crematorium. Many people in the camps had their only son there, the sole remnant left to them for survival. Among those youth are other close relatives or simply beloved friends and townsmen. All day long they ran about in agitation around the sealed block. Perhaps some ray of light might open to rescue their precious child before the sun would set. But the capo, the Jewish guards, paid no heed to their pleas and tears to remove even one youth or child. I say Jewish guards, capos were not only Jews, but some of them, youth or child from among those confined who were sentenced to burning. Just skipping to nevertheless, just to save a bit of time. Nevertheless, after much effort and negotiation by the relative, their lust, the capos, okay, the capos' lust for money prevailed. They agreed in exchange for large sums to release a particular youth or child. So that's the context, okay? The Nazis are going to send to the crematorium the youth. They have a number, okay, 3,000, and some of them still have possession, and they say, can I pay the capo so that he takes my son out of the list? Of course, the price of that is he has to put someone else instead, okay, because the Nazis here are interested in numbers. And when they say 3,000, it means 3,000 and not 2,099 particular day. So am I allowed to redeem my son with money, at the same time guaranteeing that this would mean the death of another one who was not picked up in the first place? So it's a kind of a dilemma, not so far away from what we've seen with the Talmudic text. Not exactly the same, but not so far away. Now, if you unfold the document and go a little bit further down, yeah, so yeah, perfect, thank you, excellent. So the self-sacrifice, so here's what he writes, and this now is Rav Meisel trying to deal with that situation. A Jewish man approached me, so after giving the context, and he appeared to be a simple Jew from Oberland, judging from the simplicity of the word he spoke to me. Rabbi, my only son, more precious to me than the apple of my eye, is there among the youth sentenced to burning. I have the means to redeem him. Since we know with certainty that the capos will seize another in his place, I therefore ask the rabbi a question in Halakhah, practical. Rule for me, according to Torah, whether I am permitted to redeem him. As you rule, so I shall do. So the one asking the question search for companionship. It's search for companionship of the law, companionship of Torah, at least companionship at minimum of Rav Meisels, who would be able to give him the rule. And what is interesting here is you see there is something in bracket that comes after by the editor. This is the reprint of the text of 1955. Now, I would like to turn to the 1 ter, the document 1 ter, which is the full version. So the 1 bis is just the Hebrew that I put here, but we don't need to look at the Hebrew. We need to look at what's in there. The full version adds stuff that we haven't seen. So on the question is at the end of the 2nd paragraph. Right? So you have it here. According to the law of the Torah, am I permitted to redeem him? Whatever you rule, so shall I do, which is what we just read. Then he says, right, so that's the translation from the Hebrew. And when I heard this question, a tremor seized me to issue a ruling in matter of life and death. I answered him, my dear, beloved friend, how can I issue for you a clear halakhic ruling on such a question in such a situation? Even in the time when the temple stood, such a question which concerns matters of life and death would have come before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem that sat in the chamber of the huge stone, okay, which is the Sanhedrin with the full convocation of the Sanhedrin, because it's a matter of life and death. There are different numbers according to whether it's financial question or question of human life, and so on. And here I am in Auschwitz without any halakhic work. I am in my solitude, okay? A situational solitude, not just that God abandoned me, but I don't have my books, okay? I'm kind of back to the situation of Abraham and the patriarchs who don't have the Torah. And I don't have other rabbis, and without any settled mind because of the abundance of affliction and troubles. But the man, and this is why it's interesting to go to the original text, because the 2008 version has summed up that bit. But the man keep pressing me with great weeping, and he said to me, Rebbe, you are forced to decide for me now the halakhah on this matter, because it's in question to save my only son as long as it's still possible to save him. You don't have time, okay? And I am pleading with you, my beloved. This is the rabbi answering. I am pleading with you, my beloved, who is bound to my heart. Do not hold back from me in this question, for I cannot say to you even a word, not even half a word, from any sefer, book, from any book, without any study in such a terrible and awesome situation. I don't have the terms. Halakhah doesn't have the names. It doesn't have the vocabulary to deal with the situation in which I find myself. But he continued to press me, and he said these words in Yiddish, Rebbe, does this mean that you are unable to permit me to redeem my own child? So is your loneliness situational because you don't have the books, because you don't have the other rabbis, and because you don't have the works, even in Halakhah? Does that mean that you are unable to permit me to save my son? If so, I accept with love your halakhic opinion and ruling. And then what comes after? There's a long digression that he recollected in 1955. This is then his recollection some years after the war, okay, which he's trying to find a way from memory. Is this such a way that I can allow this or not? And I want you to go to the end of the page here. However, so he finds that he doesn't have ways, to find that. And on the next page, that's where I want. And I also, top of the page here, I also pleaded with him, and I keep protesting his word. And I said to him again in Yiddish, Lid Yid, I never said that I permit you to take your child out. I'm only issuing a ruling, neither yes or no. I cannot say either yes or no. You may do so as you wish, as if you had not asked me at all. I have to send you back to your solitude. Okay? I will not answer your question. This is not even the case of Yehoshua ben Levi, who is trying to be a chassid, and he said, if it was just to look at the books, you would have, you don't need to be there. Just ask someone who knows how to read the law. Here, Rabbi Meisels doesn't want to be in this position. The solitude here is even more extreme. Okay, he doesn't want any of that. Okay, he stood still there, trying and begging me to give him a clear answer. And when he saw that I stood firm and I did not want to answer him with an halakhic ruling, he answered me with great emotion, and he said, Rebbe, I have done what is mine to do, what the Torah obligates me to do. I have asked a question before a rabbi. That's my obligation. There is no doubt. There's no other rabbi here, and you cannot give me an answer. So I take it that I may not redeem my son. Okay. So he concluded at the very end, just keep a bit, and none of my words to him had any effect. That's Meisels' recollection. Nor did he place the responsibility for this matter upon me, as if I had heard this question and given the answer. Rather, he repeated these words over and over again in all their simplicity and with weeping that tore the heart into 12 pieces. So he fulfilled his word, and he did not redeem his son. So we have the solitude of the rabbi, which I wrote. We have the solitude of the father, who here is searching for not being alone at all costs. He wants to be with Halakhah to the end. What we don't have is what is the solitude of the son. Because here in this, it's interesting that Rav Meisels in his take doesn't talk about the loneliness of the son whatsoever. But if you now go back to text 1, the Rav Meisels number 1, you will see how he has slightly changed the very end. So, here. And indeed, he kept his word. So that's the 2008 edition, which I have to admit, I don't know. So he had died in 1974. So I don't know who was in charge of redoing the second edition of his Responsa. But here's what it adds. And indeed, he kept his word and he did not redeem his son. That's kind of where our text ends. All that day, the day of Rosh Hashanah, he walked about speaking to himself with joy that he merited to offer his only son to God. For although he had the ability to redeem him, nevertheless, he did not redeem him because he saw that the Torah had not permitted him to do so. And he adds, and it would be considered before the Holy One, blessed be he, like the binding of Isaac, which also occurred on Rosh Hashanah. It's a strange ending. First, because, in terms of loneliness, we understand what it means. Suddenly, the text take it that the silence and the loneliness of the rabbi is translated into the ability to have given an exit from loneliness to the father, because suddenly the father is in company of Abraham, and is in company of Rosh Hashanah, and is in company with everything that kind of the tradition ascribes to that. Except, of course, that on Rosh Hashanah and in the binding of Isaac narrative, Isaac is not sacrificed. And here, Isaac is sacrificed. So there is here something about this tension of two loneliness that everything opposes. And the fading path of Halakhah is very much about this, is that, what happened to who? When Halakhah doesn't have the names, and I'm back to the question of naming the animal. Jacob asking to name, what is it I'm fighting against? Give me your name. But I don't give you the name. If I give you the name, you're out of the dilemma. So this question here of loneliness, I think, in this moment where Halakhah is not there anymore, okay, is really a very, very pressing issue. But it also leads to an inversion of the biblical story, okay, because in that narrative of being together with Torah, you have to twist the Torah story. You have to make it that Genesis 22 is the sacrifice of Isaac. Well, in fact, of course, it's the opposite. It's not. Which leads thinkers, and I'm thinking of André Meyer in particular, many years ago now, but he was a French biblicist, to ask the question, does Auschwitz fit into the Bible? Is Auschwitz, can you bring Auschwitz into the Bible? Are you again, because you don't have the words and you don't have the narrative that you can tell, are you, at the end of the day, in front of this solitude of an event that doesn't fit into the canon? So you have a canonical loneliness that comes here. So I'm happy to make a pause here. I have one last text which I want to do, but I'm very happy to take any question first. But the last text is a little bit different because it's about the Christian theological perspective, which so takes us out of the halakhic discussion. So I don't know if you have.
Maybe we can conclude. Start a discussion on the entire.
Sure. So okay. So the last text I want to read. I chose one, and it's a really difficult text for me, honestly, because it's very much outside my kind of confidence zone. It's a text from Moltmann. So the text is from a book which is called The Crucified God from Moltmann, and it's starting on page 61. Okay, so I read it here for those who have the text that were shared. It's at the bottom of page 61. So he writes the following. He says, the inner basis and continual assumption of Paul, who writes, in essence, here he paraphrased, we with Christ, and he's referring to Galatians, Romans, Corinthians, and other passages, is found in fact, Christ for us. Okay, so he says, be careful to read we with Christ, in fact, as meaning, in a way, the opposite in terms of the dynamic, Christ for us, which you have here at the bottom of the page. That we are crucified with Christ, as it were, simultaneously and in conformity with him, is something which comes about in faith and is possible and effective only on the basis of the revelation of God in his counterpart, in the one who was abandoned by God, and in the death of Christ for his enemies, the godless and the sinners. The significance of the cross of Christ does not derive from the crucifixion of the believer with him. It is the reverse that is true. The crucifixion of the believer with Christ takes its meaning from Christ's death on the cross of the godless, for the godless. Christ on the cross is abandoned. And this is why he says it's meaningful for us. It is not us, when I say us, not me directly, but the us here talking in a Moltmann kind of perception. It's not us being with Christ in choosing to be crucified with him, even if symbolically. It's Christ being crucified for the godless because he is himself godless at the time of his crucifixion in the sense of abandoned. And it is because of that abandonment that there is some sense of that relationship of us with Christ, Christ with us. If the meaning is to be understood as nothing more than interpreted history, and this historical interpretation is nothing more than existential repetition, then in the cross, which we follow Christ, we find his cross rather than the reverse. What does it mean for him to be in this position of godlessness? But in the first instance, the preaching of the cross does not ask the hearer whether he will allow himself to be crucified with cross. It proclaims to him Christ abandoned by God and crucified for him who is godless. It is the revelation of God in abandonment by God, the acceptance of the godless by Christ himself, taking on his abandonment, which brings him into fellowship with the crucified. And you have here this sense of loneliness that reappears. So, and I'll just finish with this before taking the question, is that we've seen that there is this kind of loneliness, Soloveitchik-like, of saying this is kind of something that brings me to, in relationship to the lonely God. Okay. And we've then seen that in reality, we're not so sure what does it mean, because there is something about what does it mean to be not good, to be alone. Yeah, that's the pious reading. The less pious reading of Soloveitchik is maybe the not good is for God. And for us, loneliness is a realm of possibility. It's an infinite power of possibilities. And then we move to the halakhic field, in which the infinite ethical possibilities and postures are only possible if we are halakhically abandoned. So we don't have the word of God in this abandonment. We face our own. But there is also an experience of loneliness in the Christian faith that, to a certain degree, with a different terminology, much more theological terminology than the one we've seen either in the rabbinic tradition or with the text of Meisels in the camps, somehow brings the two into dialogue. That there is a loneliness that is experienced by Judaism, and there is a fundamental loneliness that is experienced by Christianity, that is described by Christianity, at least according to Moltmann, that in those two loneliness, the question is, are Jews and Christians meeting in their experience of loneliness? So this is not just the relationship of Christian with Christ, but it's also the relationship of Christians' experience of loneliness as something that brings them into dialogue with the Judaism that, in a way, to be ethical, is in need of loneliness as well. So those are the texts that I wanted to present. And sorry, I didn't keep exactly the structure of time, but okay.
Thank you very much for this very intense moment that we lived together with you and your work.